Dr Buteyko's Discovery, Volume 1, The Destruction of the Laboratory, by Sergei Alchikov. Originally published in Russian by the Altmiller Publishing House, Novosibirsk, 1993. English translation published by Alex Spence, 2009. Translated by Marjorie Farquharson, Fiona Patterson, Heather Stacey, and Denise Steele. All rights reserved. Read by Kevin Archer. Foreword to Volume 1, The Destruction of the Laboratory. For over 30 years, from October 1952 to September 1985, the medical establishment hushed up my discovery. It did everything to trample on and destroy the strongest weapon in the fight against many modern diseases. I was called a charlatan, a schizophrenic, and a raving nutter, among other names. They tried to poison me 3 times and organized 2 car crashes. There were several attempts to put me in a psychiatric hospital. They physically destroyed my laboratory, which was unique throughout the world. And all of this because I had discovered a lever that patients could pull to be free from their piles of pills and complicated surgical procedures that were far from safe. But of course, this is the mainstay of pharmacology, and thousands of surgeons have won state prizes. What, after all, is easier, to recognize a discovery and decrease your own specific weight, or to accuse the author of pseudoscience? The latter is easier and more profitable. Much has changed today, but those who simply criticized the method previously are now trying to ram the genie back into the bottle from which it had begun to emerge. The discovery seems to have been recognized, but there's just one tiny catch. A trifling reservation crept into the decision. They say the method only cures asthma, mild asthma at that, instead of the list of 150 diseases that I compiled during my decades of medical practice. Well, what of it? I spent 30 years working with diseases, and in 5 millennia everyone will recognize my work, you'll see. Of course, there might not be anyone left to treat. Nevertheless, for you who are suffering from the basic diseases included in the significantly shortened list below, I resolutely declare they can be treated with my method, every last one. But there's no need to shout about it being a panacea. Only the uneducated would think so. How can it be a panacea when the list contains a few dozen illnesses, but modern medicine recognizes around 30,000? This is a mere fraction, but they are the most common. That's the whole point. I would stake my life on every line, but only for those who believe that the method is the only chance of deliverance. People who believe in massages, acupuncture, and yogi-mogis and shmogis had better not practice the method. It only helps those who are its complete supporters, not because it involves some kind of hypnosis or some other kind of suggestion, as my enemies claim. No, the method is completely physiological, but half-hearted belief is always worse than disbelief. The list of diseases of deep breathing that can be treated by the VEDB, Volitional Elimination of Deep Breathing. Yes, now, today, and not in 5,000 years' time, when it will be possible, but too late, being of sound mind and memory, I declare my discovery of the diseases of deep breathing revolutionizes the whole of medicine. KP Buteyko. From the author. We especially appreciate the truth when it comes to our health. Is what is written here true? Of course it is. Dr Buteyko is based on the famous Siberian scientist Konstantin Pavlovich Buteyko. This character was more than real, but his life and the fate of his discovery are so complicated and tragic that they should be written about in blood. Everything that is written here is true. However, the trilogy is a documentary novel. A request is therefore made to anyone offended not to take personally anything that is particularly aggravating.
Works of fiction have their own specific style. The names of those guilty of hiding Buteyko's discovery and method from the world are not given. And, as the wise saying goes, they are innocent until... With regards, the VEDB practitioner, S. Alchikov. Chapter 1. The Accident. This jeep would be the death of me, thought Dr. Buteyko, and he tried to shake off his companion's hand. Get in, Dr. Buteyko, for goodness sake! Mutin, his assistant, nudged him awkwardly towards the vehicle. Short and thick-set, he barely reached the other man's shoulder. The doctor was boyishly fit, despite his 38 years. "But where is there to sit?" Buteyko nodded at the driver, whose stooped figure could just be made out emerging from the vehicle in the darkness of the quiet May midnight. "And perhaps he doesn't want to give us a lift to the hospital." "I told you I'd take you." Stifling a cough, the driver turned his face to one side, obscuring what was already barely visible in the deepening gloom. The doctor cast a helpless glance over the poorly lit station forecourt, perhaps for the last time. Who could tell? It seemed the jeep had deliberately been parked beyond the feeble pool of light that fell on the tarmac, still gleaming from the last spring downpour. Suddenly, Buteyko remembered. He had predicted that he would be assassinated today, 15th of May, 1961, and that it would probably happen in Novosibirsk, a place he had disliked from the word go, and never taken to since. Both presentiments had come together, and there could be no mistaking their portent. On the 14th of April, at a morning planning meeting with his staff in the Laboratory of Functional Diagnostics, he had told them he would not be around much longer, and added, to his colleagues' distress, his hair unkempt after a sleepless night, "I may have less than a month. I know the medical establishment, or at least its elite, will not forgive me for my discovery." He had delivered a whole speech, with his staff listening intently, and how they had listened. After the initial 2 or 3 gasps from the women, scarcely anyone interrupted. His 50 or so white-coated colleagues, listening that morning, knew how the medical mafia got even with outsiders, and, with Buteyko, it had some scores to settle. His discovery reduced the influence of surgery so dramatically, and consigned so many rare medicines to the chemist's shelves, that the mafia would consider eliminating him a small price to pay. Naturally, his speech would not be published anywhere. You don't put those sort of things into print. On paper you say you are fighting to improve public health, but the staff at the planning meeting knew how the heads of genuine crusaders would roll from time to time. "I beg you," Buteyko raised his clenched fist, "write down, in as much detail as you can, what each of you must do in the event of my death." His colleagues wrote everything down with heavy hearts, very seriously, very professionally. Love or hate Buteyko as a man, there was no denying that his discovery of the diseases of deep breathing was turning contemporary medicine completely on its head. Until now, no one anywhere had devised a genuine cure for asthma, but Buteyko had conquered not only asthma, but dozens of other equally complex conditions, some of them far more serious, like hypertension, ischemic heart disease, TB, and diabetes. Just why he had announced that his life would be at risk in the month to come, Buteyko himself could not explain. He had the gift of second sight, and that was all. Many of his predictions and prognoses frightened the people in his circle because they were so often correct. But this 1-month threat of assassination seemed different, although there were real reasons for thinking he had little time left, no doubt about that. He had twice suffered massive vomiting after eating at the hospital canteen with his assistant Mutin. As a medical man, Buteyko knew that for anyone else the dinner would have meant one thing: sudden death from food poisoning. At least that's what would be written under cause of death in the clinic, nothing else. Professor Pomekin, his boss, would not allow any other explanation, even if a potassium cyanide capsule had been found in his soup bowl. Dr. Buteyko's food had clearly been doctored with something more subtle, not immediately amenable to forensic examination. And what sort of post-mortem would he get? They'd discover what they liked. But Mutin and his other poisoners had failed to realize one thing. Someone on Buteyko therapy does not succumb to poison so easily. A body trained in the volitional elimination of deep breathing develops exceptional immunity to poison, among other things, but Pomeykin didn't know that. Even so, before resorting to poison, the boss had tried the time-honoured soft option of locking Buteyko in a loony bin with all the other recalcitrants. How many daring, creative people had perished like that? Ignaz Semmelweis, for one, a gynecologist and obstetrician tragically poisoned by surgeons in the 19th century. Pomeykin, incidentally, was also a surgeon, and only too aware of how scalpel merchants could get even with someone they didn't like. Semmelweis had been locked away in a psychiatric hospital, then destroyed with tranquilizing injections far from prying eyes. Easy peasy. There was once a man named Semmelweis, and then, unfortunately, there wasn't. The poor sod had not stepped very far out of line, at least not by modern medical standards. He'd only asked surgeons to wash their hands before they operated, preferably with chlorine solution. Nothing too heinous about that, you'd think, washing your hands before diving into a patient's abdomen. But no. The closed-shop artisans with the scalpels paid no heed to the voice crying in the wilderness. For 13 years, nasty pieces of work like Karl Braun hounded him for his good idea, then went for broke, and consigned him, with his love of cleanliness and hygiene, to the company of the insane. True, Semmelweis was not just asking them to wash their hands out of good manners. In those days, new mothers all over the world died of blood poisoning, sepsis, during childbirth, something that was explained in a variety of ways. The moon hadn't risen correctly during delivery, or the priest had been late with his prayers. Then, one day, a friend of Semmelweis's died after carrying out a post-mortem on a woman who died of septicemia in childbirth. The friend had not been giving birth, but he had nicked his right hand while carrying out the post-mortem. Semmelweis concluded that corpses were poisonous and urged doctors to wash and disinfect their hands after carrying out a post-mortem to prevent them infecting live patients. But academics like Braun thought all this was blasphemy. What was the man talking about? Surgeons all over the world washed their hands after they operated, and now this chap was asking them to do it before. 20 years after his discovery, when Semmelweis was already dead, he had a successor in Professor Lister. True, Lister proposed a carbolic, not chlorine disinfectant, but he was hounded to death for that too. It was about 50 years before this self-evident truth was accepted, and, oddly enough, umbrellas played a part, ordinary umbrellas that you use in the rain. Patients' relatives started banging surgeons over the head with them if they hadn't washed their hands before operating. Yes, the professor obviously knew what happened to poor old Semmelweis, and so decided not to try anything too complicated with Buteyko, just dispatch him along the same well-worn path. But times had changed a little. The second half of the 20th century was not the first half of the 19th, and so Pomeykin's first plan failed, and Buteyko was not locked away. Buteyko knew why. Knew, but said nothing. So, Mutin was Pomeykin's next attempt. The fact he had been foisted on Buteyko by his boss was no particular secret. They had to share accommodation, and were constantly bumping into each other in the line of work and out of it, but never became good friends. Mutin's pale, protuberant eyes constantly watered, and were for some reason a source of irrational irritation to Buteyko, who found even Mutin's willingness to prepare an early breakfast or a late evening meal for the two of them cringing and annoying. They would sometimes grab some potato and roll mop herring, bachelor style, to save time. Buteyko never forgot that Mutin was the boss's man, and God's gift to surgery, as his staff called him behind his back, would never have sent him anyone good. Buteyko knew this, but had to put up with him. When things had recently reached crisis point with Pomekin, Buteyko realized that Mutin represented a physical danger to him and was responsible for his vomiting episodes after some meals together. Pomekin had calculated things very precisely. Mutin would either destroy Buteyko at worst, or his priceless equipment. Mutin was responsible for the laboratory apparatus. Buteyko had no doubt that Pomekin would stop at nothing. Their last major conversation had made that clear. They had talked in a real heart-to-heart, you might say, and the boss had revealed parts of his nature that were normally carefully hidden. And now, in the poet Lermontov's words, the earth could not contain them both. On this good and broad-chested earth, there was simply not enough room. And so, the day of reckoning had arrived. Buteyko noticed how keyed up Mutin was over every tiny incident. One minute he was cursing a piece of equipment, the next swearing at the builders for holding up completion of their new laboratory premises. But probably what got to him most were the doctor's words on waking in the small bedroom that they shared. "Andrei, I think I'm going to die today." When he said this, Buteyko was just feeling the after-effects of nightmares that had plagued him all night. He didn't realize it was the end of the month in which he had predicted he would die. But Mutin leapt to his feet as though stung. "Nonsense! What are you on about? That's just rubbish!" And his pale, faded eyes blinked, at once miserable and guilty. They took the workers' bus to Akademogorod, the educational and scientific centre that was being specially constructed outside Novosibirsk. They struggled to get through the experiments they had planned for the day in a lab that had been completed, then inspected the building work in progress. By the time they left, Buteyko had gradually forgotten what he'd said that morning. Then, halfway home, not far from the Inver railway junction, their bus suddenly broke down. It could have been sheer accident, of course, but during the lengthy repairs, Buteyko noticed Mutin casually stroll up to the driver, busy over the engine, and say something in his ear, after which the driver redoubled his rummaging. Mutin then went off to the station several times, on some pretext or other. Even at the time, Buteyko wondered if he was going to make a phone call to somebody. When dusk began to fall, Mutin persuaded him to take the train. They caught one of the last ones, and pulled into Novosibirsk around midnight. The dark station forecourt was virtually empty, and they were out of luck. No taxis. There was only one gloomy jeep. Black, Buteyko thought, not the usual dark green, that appeared to be waiting for someone. Mutin shouldered Buteyko away from the jeep's back door and threw open the front one. The scoundrel knows. He knows full well that I always sit in the back, thought Buteyko, and a faint pounding began in his temples. He got in the front all the same and slammed the door shut. It occurred to him that the bastards were planning a car crash, US style. He heard Mutin settling into the seat behind him, muttering something incoherent under his breath. As he started the engine, the driver cursed unnaturally loudly. "Tin-pot Russian engines!" Buteyko's insides churned. It wasn't just his enemy's idea of medicine that was cliched. Apparently even their idea of murder was. Everything, everywhere, was a poor, lifeless copy of an original idea. Mutin was probably ecstatic in the back. Buteyko half turned his head to his assistant, who grunted in the gloom of the jeep. Well, he thought, Mutin had stuck him in front, contrary to Buteyko's usual rule. The bird had given a telltale signal. He turned to face the front, brows knit. From his opponent's point of view, it was a big plus that no one knew about him, although people who copied him had become quite famous. The killers know I never usually rest my hands or feet on anything when I'm in a vehicle, he thought. I hold them relaxed and free, and I usually cross my arms over my chest. But that's usually, gentlemen. Buteyko imperceptibly stretched out his legs and braced them against the floor of the vehicle. He gave a sideways glance at the scruffy driver in his leather cap, turning the ignition key for the 100th time, and very demonstratively crossed his hands over his chest. Too early, he told himself. No need to alert them. Wait till we've started to get some speed up. Buteyko's mind thought it through clearly. You've got to outwit the bastards. Whatever else you do, you've got to outwit them. He'd imagined a US-style car crash scenario ages ago. It had good reason. The victim would be put in the front next to the driver, the car would get up to 30 or 40 miles an hour, then wham! There would be an unexpected crash with an obstacle that unexpectedly appeared on the road. Unexpected, that is, only by the intended victim. Everything would have been planned in detail, like a business operation. That sort of speed would not kill the driver, who would be in on the deal and on their books. He would be protected by the steering wheel and able to brace himself in good time. But the victim, unprepared and not holding on to anything at that slow speed, would be catapulted through the windscreen by the impact of the collision and shatter his skull on the unexpected object. Afterwards, there would be a flowery funeral and heart-rending speeches by the assassins. Crimson wreaths on a funeral mound. An accident. What could anyone have done? The jeep coughed suddenly, then leapt forward. The driver's hunched figure was rigid with tension, and he had let his leather cap slide to one side of his head. Buteyko silently prayed as he placed his hand on the metal door handle, careful not to attract attention. The vehicle raced once round the station forecourt, then out down a side street. Buteyko could feel Mutin's hot fingers digging into the back of his seat very tightly, and thought, he's scared too, the swine, before suddenly the jeep hit something very big and very hard. The impact lifted Buteyko out of his seat, and he was hurled at the windscreen.